January 1962. A county fairground 40 miles east of Los Angeles. Palm trees along the fence line. Asphalt running out in every direction. On a short piece of track near the horse barns sat 600 tons of black steel that had last worked the Wasatch Range 2.5 years earlier. It had run 1,031,205 miles. Union Pacific signed it away on December 7, 1961. That was the same day the company retired it. There was no gap between the two decisions. Nobody put the locomotive in storage first, while somebody weighed what it was still worth. The paperwork that ended its career and the paperwork that handed it to a volunteer museum carry the same date. 52 years later, Union Pacific came back to that parking lot and asked for it back. By then, the company owned two other big boys outright. One sat in Cheyenne, the other stood in Omaha, in the city where the headquarters building is. Union Pacific looked at both and walked away from both. If you ever stood next to one of these as a kid, I want to know where and what year. Put it in the comments. That is exactly what American Iron Works was built to cover. Subscribe so you catch the next one. Start with what the machine was supposed to do, because everything that happened afterward comes out of that one job. In 1940, Union Pacific had a problem on a single stretch of track. Eastbound out of Ogden, Utah, the railroad climbs into the Wasatch Range on a ruling grade of 1.14%. For every 100 feet, the train moves forward. It lifts just over a foot. That sounds like nothing. Under a freight train of 3,600 tons, it is the difference between a schedule and a stall. The railroad was solving it with helpers. 2 locomotives, sometimes 3, and on the heaviest trains 4, cut in at the bottom of the hill and cut out again at the top. That cost more than fuel. Every helper carried a crew that had to be paid whether the locomotive was pulling or sitting idle at the foot of the grade. Cutting them in and out again meant the train stopped twice on a corridor where Union Pacific was moving perishable fruit east on a clock. The railroad was not losing money on horsepower. It was losing money on the minutes spent attaching and detaching the horsepower it already had. Otto Jabelmann was Union Pacific's chief mechanical officer, and he did not design a new locomotive from scratch. Jabelmann took the 4664 Challenger. The railroad already ran and made it bigger in 4 specific ways, starting with a longer boiler and a wider firebox. 4 more driving wheels went underneath. Then he cut the diameter of every driver by 1 inch, from 69 down to 68. That last change is the one people skip past. Smaller wheels turn faster at the same road speed, which trades a little top end for a lot of pull at the drawbar. Jabelmann was not chasing speed. He was chasing the ability to take that hill alone. The American Locomotive Company built the first 20 at Schenectady in 1941 at $265,174 each. 5 more followed in 1944, and those cost $319,600 each. 25 machines. That is the entire population ever built, and no other railroad on Earth ordered a 4884. The result weighed 1,200,000 pounds with the tender behind it. The locomotive alone came to 762,000 pounds. The tender ran another 427,500 on 7 axles. Boiler pressure was 300 pounds per square inch, close to 10 times what you carry in a car tire. Tractive effort came out at 135,375 pounds of pull. No fireman alive could shovel enough coal into a fire that size by hand, so the coal came forward off the tender on a mechanical stoker rated at better than 12.5 tons per hour. Water went into the boiler through 2 injectors working on opposite sides, one of them rated at 12,500 gallons per hour and the other at 14,050. Jabelmann also drew the running gear for stability at 80 miles per hour, which no big boy ever reached hauling freight. That margin was not ambition. A machine that stays planted at 80 is a machine that will never be near its limit at 50, and 50 was the speed the fruit trains ran. And it worked. It did exactly the job Jabelmann drew it to do. One big boy on the point took the tonnage over the Wasatch without a helper anywhere on the train, and Union Pacific stopped paying for the crews it had been cutting in and out at the bottom of the hill. The part that stays with me is how narrow the specification was. This was not a general-purpose locomotive that happened to be large. It was a tool cut for one grade, in one canyon, on one subdivision, and every dimension on it was set by that grade. Which is why the railroad had to change to fit the machine instead of the other way around. Look at the curves first. A big boy runs 132 feet 9 inches from the pilot to the back of the tender. The frames are hinged, so the front engine swivels away from the boiler when the locomotive enters a curve. That articulation lets a 133-foot machine take a 20-degree curve, which is a radius of 288 feet, tight enough for the mountain. But the boiler still overhangs on the outside of that curve. On double track, the overhang put the locomotive into the space where a train on the adjacent track was passing. Union Pacific's answer was not to redesign the boiler. The railroad went out and widened the affected curves by a few feet so the two trains would clear each other. Then look at the turntables. A locomotive that long will not fit on standard equipment. Union Pacific installed 135-foot turntables at the servicing points on the route, at Green River and at Ogden, because there was nowhere else to turn one. Heavier rail went down in places. Track between Green River and Ogden was eased. Add it up and you get something most people never picture when they look at one of these. The big boy did not simply arrive on the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific was rebuilt around it, in concrete and steel and survey stakes, before the first one turned a wheel in revenue service. And there is one more thing they built into it, and this one is not on any spec sheet. The firebox on a big boy has a grate area of 150 square feet. That is roughly the floor of a small bedroom, burning coal, under the back of the locomotive. Every write-up calls that a consequence of size. A bigger locomotive needs a bigger fire. That is true, and it is only half the reason. Union Pacific owned coal mines in Wyoming. The coal coming out of those mines was low-grade semi-bituminous, and low-grade coal does not burn hot enough per pound to feed a boiler that big through a normal firebox. So the grate got sized to the fuel. The firebox on the largest steam locomotive ever built is that large in part because the railroad was burning what it already dug out of ground it already held. Oil was common by 1941. Plenty of Western railroads had gone to it. Union Pacific stayed on coal because coal was an internal transfer on the company books and oil was a check written to somebody else. That decision is cast into the shape of the machine. A firebox sized around a coal seam the company owned is not engineering pride. It is accounting in steel plate 30 feet long. The big boys burned up to 11 tons of coal an hour when they were working hard, out of a tender that held 56,000 pounds and 24,000 gallons of water. That number does not fit the way most people picture these locomotives. Which part surprises you more, that the fire was designed around the fuel, or that the fuel came out of the railroad's own ground? Now hold that thought, because the same railroad tried the other fuel once, and it failed. Big Boy number 4005 was converted to burn oil during the steam era as an experiment. It did not work. The conversion used a single burner, and a single burner cannot heat a firebox that wide evenly. The fire ran hot in the middle and cold at the edges. Union Pacific put 4005 back on coal and never revisited it. Nobody tried multiple burners. By then, the diesel program was moving, and there was no reason to spend engineering time on a steam locomotive with a decade left. Remember that failure. It comes back at the end of this story in a way I did not expect. The last revenue run by a big boy ended in the early morning of July 21st, 1959. But the fleet did not go straight to the torch. Union Pacific held them. On November 30th, 1958, a system status report showed every big boy in storage, and then on July 6th, 1959, number 4014 was the first one pulled back out to cover a traffic surge the diesels could not absorb. 2 weeks later, it was over for good. Even then, the railroad kept hedging. 4 big boys were held at Green River in operable condition, ready to run, until September 1962. That is 3 years after the last revenue train. A company that had already committed to diesel power was still paying to keep 4 of these alive as insurance. Every one of those 4 was eventually scrapped. 17 went to the torch in total, 8 survived. And here is where the whole thing turns on something nobody designed. By 2012, Union Pacific wanted an operating big boy for the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the man who had run the steam program before Ed Dickens had already explained why that was a bad idea. Steve Lee's objection was not sentiment or cost, it was geometry. By his account, there were only 2 places left on the entire Union Pacific system large enough to turn a big boy, and those 2 places were a few miles apart from each other. Think about what that means operationally. You restore the largest steam locomotive in the world, and then it can go out and it can come back, and the only places it can be turned around are within sight of each other. Lee was right. He was right for as long as the question was an operating question. What changed was not the geometry. The locomotive had stopped being motive power and become a marketing asset. And a marketing asset does not need to be turned efficiently, it needs to be seen. So Union Pacific went looking, and this is the part of the story that should embarrass the company more than it does. The 2 big boys it still owned were the 2 it could not use. Number 4004 stood at Cheyenne and 4023 at Omaha. Both had spent roughly 60 winters outdoors in Wyoming and Nebraska. Water gets into a boiler, freezes, expands, thaws, and does it again every year for 6 decades. Union Pacific evaluated both and set both aside. Then it looked at other survivors. Many had been stripped over the years, with parts pulled off to keep something else alive. And then it looked at Pomona. Number 4014 had been sitting on a county fairground in Southern California since January 8, 1962. Los Angeles County gets no hard freeze. The boiler had never gone through a single freeze and thaw cycle in 52 years. That is the reason. It was not engineering that saved this locomotive, and it was not budget, and it was not corporate will. Latitude. Trains magazine put the dry Southern California climate first among the factors that made 4014 the candidate, ahead of everything else. Most of the critical hardware was still on the locomotive, from the air brake system down to the injector nozzles. And volunteers at the Rail Giants Museum had spent decades painting it and lubricating specific joints and connections without being paid on a site that opened free to the public 1 weekend a month. Union Pacific built 25 of these. What kept the last working one restorable was a county with no winter and a group of people with grease guns. I want to be careful here because there is an accusation sitting in this story that the evidence does not fully support. Nobody has documented the condition of 4004 and 4023 when Union Pacific evaluated them. We know both were set aside. Whether the railroad neglected them, or whether static outdoor display in Wyoming simply destroys a boiler no matter who owns it and how much they care, is not on the record anywhere. My own read is that it is the second one. Steamtown's big boy needed hazardous material remediation and structural repairs after decades outside, and that is a national park, not a railroad with an earnings call. Outdoor display kills boilers. Wyoming just kills them faster, but the outcome is the same either way, and the outcome is the point. What came next was the strangest recovery in American preservation. The locomotive had to cross a parking lot before it could reach a railroad. Union Pacific cut the pavement, excavated 14 inches down, and set the first panel. Then the crew leapfrogged 40-foot sections of track around the locomotive, over and over, moving each panel more than 21 times to get across the lot. About 4,500 feet of temporary track went down. It started moving November 14, 2013. It reached the main line January 26, 2014. 10 weeks. Call it 60 feet a day. The most powerful steam locomotive ever built, averaging the length of 2 school buses a day in the slowest mile it ever traveled. What Union Pacific paid for it was a used diesel. An SD-40-2 built in 1979 with 2.4 million miles on it, plus a boxcar and a caboose. The diesel sits today in the exact spot the big boy occupied. Then a TOW of 1,293 miles to Cheyenne and 5 years in the shop. On February 5, 2019, the rebuilt boiler was pressure tested to 375 pounds per square inch, 25% above its maximum working pressure. Late on the night of May 1st, 4014 moved under its own power for the first time since 1959. And when Union Pacific put it back together, it converted the locomotive to oil. The same conversion that failed on 4005 70 years earlier. The problem then was one burner heating a firebox that was oversized because the company was burning its own cheap coal. The solution was more burners, and nobody in the 1950s had a reason to go find it. So the enormous grate that existed to burn Wyoming coal is now fed by oil, and the fuel advantage that shaped the machine is gone, and the machine runs anyway. Here is what 52 years in a parking lot actually proved. Everything Union Pacific built to support the big boy is gone. The 135-foot turntables are gone. The widened curves carry freight that never needed them. The company mines that set the size of the firebox stopped mattering the moment the fuel changed. The entire physical plant that justified this locomotive outlived it by nothing at all. The big boy was not beaten because diesels were better at everything. It was beaten because it was better at exactly one thing, on exactly one grade, burning exactly one fuel, and when any of those three moved, there was nowhere else on the map to send it. That is the cost of precision. A machine built to fit one job perfectly cannot be reassigned when the job changes. 17 went under the torch inside 3 years, and the railroad that had rebuilt its own route for them did not fight it. And the one that lived did not survive because of any of that. It survived because somebody parked it where it does not freeze, and volunteers kept the joints greased, and Union Pacific happened to need a locomotive 52 years later and found the only one left that the weather had not taken apart. Union Pacific did not save Big Boy 4014. A county with no winter did, and a railroad noticed in time. Watch it go by and you are not looking at preservation. You are looking at the survivor of a selection process nobody ran on purpose, and there is no second one behind it because the other 7 spent their decades somewhere. It snows. That is the kind of story American Iron Works goes after. Subscribe and you will get the next one.